Shalom, Chavrim. James Trim here, and today I want to talk to you about the Munster Hebrew version of Matthew, or the Munster Hebrew text of Matthew. The Munster Hebrew text of Matthew is very closely related to the Deutele Hebrew version of Matthew, or the Deutele Hebrew manuscript of Matthew. We did a recent video on the Deutele, series of videos actually, but a recent video on the origin and significance of the Deutele Hebrew version of Matthew, and then we did some follow-up videos about that version of Matthew. I'll put a link to the first video that we did, that was the introductory video, and about the Deutele Hebrew version of Matthew. The Munster Hebrew text of Matthew was published by Sebastian Munster in 1537, he having obtained this Hebrew manuscript of Matthew from, quote, among the Jews. Before I get started, though, I want to ask everybody to please donate to support these videos. For those that don't know, my wife is chronically ill. She's disabled and she suffers chronic pain, and I am her caretaker. So your donations not only help make these videos possible, but make it possible for me to be able to be here to care for her and manage our expenses, pay for her medications, etc. So you can donate by clicking on the donate link in the video description. You can also do that by sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. All right, and also I'd like to ask everybody to please like this video, subscribe to this channel, click on the notification bell so you'll get notifications when new videos come out. Let us know what you think of our videos in the comments. Participate in the discussions in the comments. These are all things that the YouTube algorithm looks at to decide which videos to recommend to new users, and we want to get recommended to new users. Also, share these videos with your friends on social media, Facebook, Twitter, etc. Also, there is a handout where you can, PDF handouts where you can follow along with us in our study here. And you can do that by clicking on the handouts link also in the video description. And the first page of our handouts starts out explaining the history of and background of the Munster Hebrew version of Matthew. Version is not the word, the Hebrew text of Matthew. So Sebastian Munster was a Hebrew teacher who in the 16th century published many Swiss books for Hebrew and Aramaic language students. And he also published many books about geography. In his books on Hebrew, he often gave examples, and in his classes that he taught, he often used examples coming from a Hebrew copy of Matthew that he received from the Jews. Many people asked him to publish this Hebrew gospel, this Hebrew Matthew, and so he decided to hold off his other studies in order to work full-time to publish this Hebrew text of the Gospel of Matthew. It agrees very closely with the Deutele Hebrew version of Matthew, or the Hebrew manuscript of Deutele Hebrew manuscript of Matthew. They're very similar. They're definitely different manuscripts of the same Hebrew version of Matthew, with just a few variances here and there. And both quite a bit different than from the Shem Tov Hebrew version of Matthew, which has a minor relationship to them, certainly has an in Hebrew relationship to them, but is very different. We'll do a separate video on the Shem Tov Hebrew manuscript, or sorry, the Shem Tov Hebrew version of Matthew on another occasion. So the Munster Hebrew text was published in 1537, and then again a second edition was published in 1557 after Sebastian Munster's death. So he published in 1537, Then his publisher published an updated edition in 1557. That 1557 edition also included a Hebrew text of the book of Hebrews that Sebastian Munster had obtained from the Jews in an appendix. So the Hebrew version of Matthew, or the Hebrew text of Matthew that was published by Sebastian Munster, was actually, or is actually, much more valuable to us than previously believed, and that is because of an academic mistake that was made very early on by authors that were examining this book. By the way, I was early on in my research, decades ago, I managed to obtain facsimile pages of all the pages of Munster's text of Matthew here. So it's all right here. And also in 1551, one of Sebastian Munster's students published a reprint or a text that was almost identical to Munster's text, almost identical. In fact, the differences may simply have been inadvertent typos. And this was published in 1551 in Paris. Okay. And one of the interesting things about this edition that was published by one of his students is that in the margins, he published, let's see if I can find an example here real quick. In the margins, he published alternate readings, here in the margins, from other Hebrew manuscripts of Matthew that he had access to then in the 16th century that have since been lost, that were manuscripts apparently of this same version of Matthew but had slightly variant readings. So that 1551 edition is very useful. I managed to, as you can see, also obtain facsimiles of all of the pages of that 16th century book, and to obtain access to all those marginal notes. So a rumor circulated or got started, almost like a game of telephone or gossip, where the person whispers something in an ear and gets it wrong, and then the message gets passed on wrong. A little bit different from that. A scholar misunderstood. A scholar by the name of Herbst, Adolf Herbst, a German scholar, in the 19th century, misunderstood something that Munster wrote in his introduction. And that misunderstanding led to a marginalization of the importance of the text. Let me explain. George Howard, in his Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, which is a translation and publication of the Shem Tov text in 1995, wrote about the Munster text on page 161, quote, and this is in your handout on the first page of your handouts, in the letter of dedication, Munster reported that he had received the Hebrew Matthew from the Jews in defective form with many lacunae, and had from necessity restored what was lacking in the manuscript. His work today is of limited value because he failed to mark the passages he had restored. Now, lacunae means holes, okay? And it's a term that is used in textual criticism a lot of times to refer to missing passages, missing text, or even literal holes in a manuscript. So I actually have Munster's Latin that he's referencing here in the Latin in your handout. I'm not going to try to read the Latin, but if you're interested, the Latin is there in the handout. literally in English, what Munster wrote is the Gospel of Matthew in the original, the actual Hebrew language, is not as it is among the people in the Hebrew. I came upon it lacerated, but I reintegrated it and published a rendering of it in one body. Lacerated means cut. Okay, you've heard of people that have lacerations, for example. This word lacerated, unfortunately, became interpreted with lacunae. But I don't believe that was accurate. So the Shem Tov Hebrew version of Matthew, for those that are familiar, we'll be doing another video on it in the future, was transcribed by Shem Tov ben Shaprut it was divided up into 114 sections, which he published in his book, The Touchstone, the Evan Bohan. Each section was followed by a rebuttal. So there'd be a little piece of Matthew, and then a rebuttal to what that piece of Matthew said, and then another little piece of Matthew, and it was a critique. But in the process, Shem Tov ben Shaprut did something he had not intended to do, which was preserve the Hebrew text of Matthew he had in his hands in the 12th century, I believe, though that was a corrupt text, and that'll be covered in another video in the future. Nonetheless, he divided it up, and he actually wrote, and I quote Shem Tov, "I adjure by the life of the world that every copyist, that he not copy the books of the gospel unless he writes in every place the objections that I have written, just as I have arranged them and written them." So he didn't want anybody to do what George Howard did and put those pieces back together again without his objections. He wanted them printed that way forever. Okay. Now the Dutele Hebrew manuscript was all written together. Okay. It's a different version of Matthew, but it was all written together, but it was followed by a series of rebuttals. And it therefore may also have once also been spliced into sections with rebuttals in each, to each section, and then another piece, and then a rebuttal to that piece. So Munster's statement seems to indicate that he obtained the Hebrew Matthew that he obtained from the Jews lacerated or cut up in sections, and that he reintegrated these sections and published the Hebrew text in one body. Unfortunately, Adolf Herbst, a German scholar in the 19th century, misunderstood Munster, and in 1879 he paraphrased him in German as saying, "I'm not going to read the German, it's here in German in your handout." But literally in English, he said, the Hebrew translation Munster reports in his dedication letter to Heinrich VIII, he received it from the Jews mangled or defective, with many spaces. Seeing this, he took upon himself to supplement such spaces. And that led Hugh Schoenfield to report in English in his 1927 translation of the Dutele Hebrew version of Matthew, pages 11 through 12, he writes, "Munster states in his dedication to Henry VIII that he received the Hebrew translation from the Jews in a defective condition with many lacunae, which he took upon himself to fill in." So the problem began with when Herbst translated the Latin lacerum inveni, it was found lacerated, as in German Mangelhaft und mit vielen Luken empfangen, and I don't speak German, or mangled or defective and many spaces. And then Schoenfield rendered that in English, or paraphrased that in English, as in a defective condition with many lacunae. Then the next phrase, mangled, in Munster's Latin, sin, I'm going to do my best, said, well, I'm not even going to try and read the Latin. It's here in your text. But reintegrated it and published a rendering of it in one body, but which Herbst translated in German to mean, seeing this, took upon himself to supplement such spaces. And then Schoenfeld rendered that in English, or paraphrased that in English, which he took upon himself to fill in. Thus, a myth was born, as Howard wrongly reports on page 161 of Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. George Howard wrongly reports, in the letter of dedication, Munster reported that he had received the Hebrew Matthew from the Jews in defective form with many lacunae, and had from necessity restored what was lacking in the manuscript. His work today is of limited value because he failed to mark the passages he had restored. So the actual truth is that what Munster said was that he found it lacerated or cut up into pieces, and he reintegrated the pieces and put it back together again, restored it. But then by the time he writes that in Latin, and then Herbst takes that and interprets it in German, paraphrases it in German, and then Hugh Schoenfeld paraphrases that into English, and then George Howard takes that and not only repeats that myth, but then interprets the myth to mean that his work today is of limited value because he failed to mark the passages that he restored, is a terrible mistake. Because Munster wasn't saying that he found holes in the manuscript, missing passages or spaces in the manuscript, and filled them in with text that he made up out of thin air to restore it, and therefore it's of limited value because we don't know what the original said or where these places that he filled it in are. In fact, if you compare with the du Tillet manuscript, that doesn't seem very likely to be the case. But instead what he said was that he found it lacerated, or he found it in separate sections that were spaced apart from each other, with the rebuttals, by the way. He doesn't say that, but apparently from everything else we know about Hebrew Matthew that was being passed around amongst the Jews at the time. And he reintegrated the text into one body and put these separated passages all back together again, just like George Howard did with the Shem Tov Hebrew text of Matthew that was in similar form. So the Munster Hebrew text of Matthew is a second witness, an additional witness to the very same Hebrew version of Matthew that we find in the du Tillet Hebrew manuscript of Matthew. And we actually have yet another third witness to that text, and in some cases variances, multiple variances, because the 1951 edition by Munster's student Johannes, what was his name? Johannes Quinquerbus. There it is for you. In fact, I'll let that sit on the screen. Of course, you can pause it for just a minute. That's the 1551 edition here. Has lots of marginal notes from yet other witnesses to this same Hebrew version of Matthew that are no longer extant, but have variants printed in the margins. He writes in the introduction to his edition, by the way, and I quote, "I would not dare to affirm anything on the matter that what I think is needful in consideration." This is a translation from the Latin, by the way. of a sufficiency of authorities. If, however, Munster has recommended to us as almost certainly better restorations or additions of his own suggestion by asterisk or whatever other sign he noted them, to the extent that we know the style and phraseology of the ancient author, the better judgment has been placed on the author. When St. Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew, I think, following the many opinions of illustrious men, saying so, that no one, unless he wanted to be tarnished or resist the truth, would turn in such a true pearl for a marble. So here he indicates his belief that the Hebrew text of Matthew that Munster published was a representative of the original Hebrew text that was the work of Matthew himself. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the actual manuscript, unlike the Dutellet Hebrew manuscript of Matthew that was published in 1553. We don't have the actual Hebrew manuscript of Matthew that Munster had in his hands. We only have the printed edition that he printed from the manuscript that he had in his hands. And we also don't have the various manuscripts that his student had available to him in the 16th century that he used to compile his marginal notes. All we have are the marginal notes. Still, these are very helpful witnesses and additional witnesses to the same Hebrew text of Matthew that we find in the Dutellet Hebrew version. And this is, I believe, and as we demonstrated in our video on the Dutellet Hebrew version and some of the follow-up videos we did on the Dutellet Hebrew version of Matthew, a descendant of the original Hebrew that was the original Hebrew that Matthew himself wrote, and was only later translated into Greek, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and other European languages, including English. All right. So before I close, I'd just like to ask everybody to please donate to support these videos. You can do that by clicking on the donate link in the video description. And you can do that by also by sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. I also have to ask everybody to please like this video, subscribe to this channel, click that notification bell so you'll find out when new videos come out. Let us know what you think of our videos in the comments and participate in the discussions in the comments section. Share these videos on YouTube. I'm sorry, not on YouTube, or on YouTube. Share them on Facebook. Share them on Twitter. Share them on social media with your friends. And all these things will help us get in front of new viewers. All right. So until next time, everybody, shalom.